The 7800X3D was the best gaming CPU out there in the previous generation, and today we get to unveil its replacement. The 9800X3D is like a 9700X with a big old stack of Vcache, and this one is the new greatest of all time. Welcome to Machines More. With the initial Ryzen 9000 launch, it was immediately apparent that in terms of gaming performance, the 7800X3D still could not be beat. And a lot of folks maybe scrambled to grab one while it was relatively affordable at around $340, $350 US. This guy, however, is the Gaming King Ryzen 9000 CPU that a lot of folks have been waiting for, and the Ryzen 7 8-core 16-thread 9800X3D is going to see retail availability tomorrow. So in this review, I'll cover what's new, how well it runs, especially versus the 7800X3D and the 9700X, and I'll give you my recommendation on this CPU. It's a very interesting one, and actually in a dedicated video, I'll discuss cooling and cooler choice for this CPU if you do decide to get it. And having tested this one thoroughly, I do anticipate that a lot of you will actually be interested in grabbing one of these. So real quick before we begin, I did want to thank AMD for working with the channel on this one and providing the test CPU. However, this video is not paid for or sponsored by AMD, and you can expect independent testing and an objective review today. If you enjoy content like this, please go ahead and click that subscribe button because it really helps. Thanks a lot. Okay, so why is this Zen 5 Ryzen 9000 CPU such a big deal for gaming? Well, it has to do with what AMD calls its 3D V-cache or vertical cache. Like the 9700X, it features 8 Zen 5 cores on a single chiplet that share 32 megabytes of L3 cache. But further added to this is an additional 64 megabytes of vertical cache, which AMD is calling its second generation 3D V-cache. In total, you have 96 megabytes of L3 cache for the CPU, and that's what sets the X3D chips apart. And that extra cache leads to lower latency and increased frame rates in applications and games that can take advantage of it. AMD likely released this one first to put a stamp on the competition. Intel's new Arrow Lake launch was a phenomenal head scratcher, especially when it comes to gaming, and why not just capitalize on that, right? The 8-core X3D chip may have dual chiplet company soon, but this is going to be the mainstream gaming one that's going to sell a lot better, and this is likely going to be the best Ryzen 9000 CPU for gaming, both from a performance and a pricing perspective, just like the 7800X3D was. The 7800X3D and the AM4 sockets 5800X3D both had that extra 64 megabytes of Vcache, but for the 9800X3D there has been a significant change. So previously the Vcache was stacked on top of the CPU cores, so between the IHS and the CCD, but for this one the Vcache die is actually moved underneath. And that actually has a big implication for cooling. Since the Vcache die doesn't sit between the CCD and the IHS anymore, the heat is going to be transferred more directly to your cooler. And by the way, if you're concerned about the impact on the Vcache die temp, that itself is not as temperature sensitive, and therefore the placement makes more sense this way. Cooling the previous gen X3D is an interesting conundrum because on one hand it barely sips power, which is kind of confusing because it's spec'd as a 120 watt TDP chip, which by AMD's typical specs, 120 watt TDP CPUs can draw up to 162 watts of package power. But the 7800X3D for an all-core process, even if you gave it over-the-top cooling, would still only sit at a paltry 90 watts of package power drawn down. And that's a lot closer to how a 65 watt TDP chip behaves. Those chips draw down 88 watts max usually. So really it was behaving more like a 65 watt TDP chip. In terms of the power exhausted into your system from the 7800X3D, it's not difficult to get rid of that heat, right? Because it's only a minuscule amount. However, because the CCD was located under the Vcache, the CPU itself is so thermally dense, it was difficult to transfer that heat to the IHS and then to the cooler's cold plate. So you would usually see higher die temps even with that small power draw. So the higher cooling recommendation there is really more related to the difficulty of the heat transfer. And AMD actually even spec'd a max operating temp of 89 degrees while locking down the chip for manual overclocking. The 9800X3D is also rated at 120 watts TDP, but with the thermal rework, this rating here actually has, it's more reflective, it has more of a direct correlation to the spec power behaviors. Now the CPU will usually draw down around 140 watts, sometimes even up to 150 watts for an all-core process. It gets close to that 162 watt socket max for 120 watt TDP AMD CPUs. AMD was then comfortable bumping up the max temp to the same 95 degrees as other Ryzen 9000 CPUs, and with the increased power, they also bumped up the base clock's 500 MHz and the boost clock's 200 MHz. So this one on spec, it runs at a 4.7 GHz base clock and a 5.2 GHz boost clock, and you can see the importance of the thermal improvement from repositioning that Vcache die, because even drawing down 55% more power here, it runs cooler than the 7800X3D when they have the same cooling solution. One thing that's interesting about the 9800X3D was that I found very little difference between the single core boost clocks versus the all core boost clocks. Whether it was single core Cinebench, gaming, or a heavy all core render, the boost clocks hovered around the 5.2 GHz spec, and that's rather unique. As an example, the 9700X can hit as high as 5.5 GHz on a single core for single core Cinebench, but when you configure at 105 watts TDP for an all-core process, those all-core clocks go down significantly to just under 5.1 GHz. In gaming, we're clocking faster at 5.2 GHz here, but also drawing down about 26% more power than the 7800X3D. It's going to be lower than a 9700X at its stock 65 watt TDP and lower than the 105 watt TDP option in terms of the gaming power draw. Here I'm using the in-game benchmark for Far Cry 6 just to get a consistent estimation of the gaming power draw. Now this one does tend to be purposely more intensive than if you were just running around the island, where you would typically see 10 watts or so lower on average, just for reference. But the takeaway here is that for gaming, it's going to draw more power than the 7800X3D. And as we saw, it was a tremendous amount more when all cores are fully loaded. So if you were hoping for a power sipping chip like the 7800X3D in the 9800X3D, that's not exactly what this is, although in general it's still a very efficient CPU. This one is also going to be more fun if you prefer manual tuning, because you can now set a manual overclock. But as with the last few Ryzen generations, tuning PBO with curve optimizer offset, it's still generally going to be the more dependable way to squeeze out more performance. Just give it plenty of cooling and play with the curve optimizer a bit. Here with the 360 AIO and letting the boost clocks float up to plus 200 MHz max, it yielded 5350 MHz on all cores. And I did see about a 2% bump in Cinebench scores this way, so nothing too crazy. Of course, I think a lot of CPUs can get more than a negative 15 offset, so that's where you have to do some experimentation. With a little manual OC, it did get it up to 5.45 GHz on all cores at 1.275 volts. At that point, I was drawing about 142 watts, and that gets us a 4% bump over the stock settings. It's really nothing huge to write home about, single-digit gains mostly, but if you do want to play around with this one, it's definitely going to be more fun than the 7800X3D in that department, so that's a good thing here. For our performance comparison today, I'm going to be focusing in on the previous generation, 7800X3D, and the 9700X. These are both 8-core parts. The 9700X has seen a price drop recently. Also, it now has a 105 watt configurable TDP option since my initial review of it, and maybe we'll have to do a review just looking at that setting change, but it is perhaps a bit more compelling than a few months ago, and those will be the comparisons that give us insight into how good the 9800X3D is. I have also tested the new Intel Ultra 265K, which is the 14700K replacement, which is an 8 performance core and 12 E-core part. So I'll include those benchmarks where I've tested that one before. The CPU here was tested with a 360mm AIO with the ASUS X870E board, and 6000 MHz DDR5, which is the sweet spot RAM speed for Ryzen 9000. So I mentioned this earlier. This one actually really feels like a 9700X with Vcache stacked on top, I guess on bottom, which is a great thing, because previously you couldn't say that the 7800X3D was simply a 7700X with Vcache, because it was downvolted, it was lower power, and I think AMD made concessions in the power department because of the placement of that Vcache die. So the 7800X3D almost always performed worse than the 7700X when it came to non-gaming applications. So there was always a trade-off if you wanted to choose the X3D over the non-X3D counterpart. And neat thing is, as you'll see with the 9800X3D, you can actually have it all. So it may be counterintuitive since this is a gaming-focused chip, but the biggest gen-over-gen gains that you'll see today are going to be in the non-gaming department. Let's jump right into Cinebench R23. For convenience and comparison in the graphs, I've grouped the 9800X3D 7800X3D, 9700X, and 5800X3D together. So you'll always see those grouped at the top in the same order, regardless of performance. And I've then ranked the other ones based on the score beneath that top group. For multi-core, Cinebench R23, the 9800X3D appears to completely leave the 7800X3D in the dust. There's roughly a 36% gain here. And it is, in fact, a little bit more powerful than the 9700X at the 105 watt CTDP. Noting, of course, that at this setting, the 9700X draws practically the same amount of power as the 9800X3, so it's a fair comparison directly. If you're curious how much of the gain here over the 7800X3D is due to the increased power spec, I did set it at 90 watts power limit for the 9800X3D, and we're seeing about a 17.5% increment still. So the percentage gains akin to what we saw when we compared the 9700X to the 7700X on a power normalized basis, which was around 15%. But it does appear that most of the gains over the 7800X3D are due to the increased power draw, the increased power spec, which, love it or hate it, is something that AMD can only do now with the improved thermal design. R24, similar gaps, again 9800X3D winning over the 9700X by small margins. For your single core Cinebench, there's about a 17% boost over the 7800X3D. Here, the 9700X does have an advantage over the X3D part, and that's going to be due to the higher single core boost clock, where, as we saw earlier, it can hit 5.5 GHz versus only 5.2 GHz on the X3D at stock. Huge gains here for a blender. Basically, we're getting almost a 25% reduction in time to completion versus the 7800X3D and about 33% more samples per minute. Also, against the 9700X, we're still seeing the X3D counterpart ahead by a little bit. 3D Mark's Time Spy CPU, significantly better over the 7800X3D, and that same small gap over the 9700X at the higher power target. Another synthetic test here, Geekbench 6, there's around a 25% gain against the 7800X3D for both single core and multi-core. 7-zip benchmark, again, big gap over the 7800X3D, about 6% better than the 9700X. Some additional applications for your reference. I have PujaBench here for DaVinci Resolve, which is video editing software, and that also does involve the GPU. We're seeing a big impact from the Zen 5 design and a small but consistent bump up over the 9700X. This whole time, probably noticed that Intel's 265K has been trolling us in a way. It's actually been performing really well for these tests, but you'll see it's a really odd CPU at this point in time when we get to the gaming benchmarks, which is really where the 9800X3D's forte is. But here, the 265K is just a tiny bit better than the X3D. For Handbrake X264 and X265 encoding, there's that same general trend we've been seeing. So hopefully I don't sound like a broken record, but you get the idea. To sum up, right, the non-gaming performance, it's significantly better, 25 to 30% better as a whole compared to the 7800X3D. And keeping in mind, it does typically draw down about 55% more power when fully loaded. And it is interesting a tiny bit, but consistently around 3 to 5% better than the 9700X at that higher 105 watt CTDP, where it has a similar power draw. So if you're looking for more of a gaming focus, but still good workstation performance type of all-rounder, I think this is way more serviceable than the 7800X3D was. And as mentioned, the 265K is really, really good in this type of arena, which is what you expect for something with 20 cores, right? Because those E cores, they're weaker, but they still do work. But it's tragic how bad the CPU is at this point in time for gaming, which is where we're going to get to right now. So with the Ryzen 9000 reviews, we saw incremental gains for gaming performance. For example, the 9700X versus the 7700X was a small gap, perhaps 5% for the 1080 Geo mean, maybe 4% for 1440, and that's roughly where we're going to see versus the 7800X3D, because unlike the multi-core stuff, where your 9800X3D is drawing down significantly more power. For gaming, I did note it's just a little bit more power hungry, but it's not on the same level as the productivity stuff. So we should be mainly seeing the impact of the new Zen 5 cores. And after all, like the 7800X3D, we still have 64 megabytes of V cache. So it's kind of like for like in that department. So we're really seeing the impact of the Zen 5 design. Testing here with the 4080 Super. I'll just go ahead and talk through some of the highlights, and I'll just let the rest of the benchmarks play out. And a quick note for the 9700X, because I did want to simplify things so that what you're seeing, everything is with the 105 watt CTDP enabled. Far Cry 6 is a title where Zen 5 has pretty big gains, and we're seeing that here too, about a 20% bump here. The Vcache does have a sizable impact on this title if you just compare it to the 9700X. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, you got 2024 coming soon, but we're still on 2020 for now. There's about an 8% bump on the averages over the 7800X 3D. So if this is your main title or interested in 2024, I think this is looking like the best CPU for that. Newly launched Call of Duty Black Ops 6. Due to this just having launched, I wasn't able to properly benchmark all the other CPUs, but I did manage to squeeze in the three main ones here for our comparison. And they all perform well. There's very little difference between them, but the 9800X3D is ahead of both. The 9700X performs remarkably well here as well. And in this scenario, the Vcache doesn't look like it's doing a whole lot. Here's a title where you won't see a difference on the averages. Assassin's Creed Mirage will have both 7800X3D and 9800X3D at the same exact average FPS. But you'll notice, even in this scenario, the frame times are going to be more consistent. And that's the same thing we see with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. In fact, the 9800X3D dips below the 7800X3D. It's likely run-to-run variant, but better consistency as well, slightly. Taking a look at the geomean for the 8 titles, a blend of new and old AAA strategy, just to give you a general idea where this places. It's very, very good. This is going to be gaming's new best in class. It's better than the 7800X3D, which was previously the best in class. Better than the 14900K, and as for Arrow Lake, I actually had instability for the 265K for AOE4, so this geomean is not meaningful for that chip. But when I omit that title and I just compare against the 9800X 3D to get a fair comparison, it's going to be about a 20% increment over Arrow Lake, and that's what I expect in general over Arrow Lake in terms of the averages. So yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on with that release, but for the time being, I really would steer clear of Arrow Lake. About 5% over the 7800X 3D for both 1080 and 1440. So this one is definitely closer to the Ryzen 9000 versus 7000 incremental gains we saw with the 9600X and 9700X over its predecessors. Versus the 9700X here, at least with my testing suite, the Vcache gets you about a 10% bump over the 9700X at 1080. It's definitely not insignificant, but it's important to keep in mind it can range from not having an impact on the averages to having a completely outsized impact on something like Far Cry 6. In general, from what I've seen for gaming, the power draw is very reasonable, and in general, it only draws a little bit more than the 7800X 3D, but considering that efficiency, yet it still has top-in-class performance, I think this is the real deal for gaming. All right, decisions. Pricing for this CPU, it's slated at $479 US, basically $480, and that is a bump of $30 from where the 7800X 3D launched. So it's definitely reasonable in light of that for gaming's new king. We've seen some steep price cuts for other Zen 5 chips like the 9700X, and I think that's actually going to be the main competition right now in this arena. The 7800X 3D is priced very odd, likely on purpose right now, which arguably is a good strategy since the lowered Ryzen 7000 prices at the time of the first Ryzen 9000 launches made Zen 5 a lot less palatable. But like I mentioned, the 9800X 3 is very much a 9700X with added Vcache. In fact, it performs even a little bit better for the non-gaming stuff, and depending on the title, can be much better for gaming, but at last check, 323 US currently. So that's where I'll have to do some hand wringing, because the 9800X 3D is definitely a good CPU, but is the almost $160 premium right now worth it over the also very, very good 9700X? And I've shown you some of the biggest improvements in Far Cry 6, MSFS 2020. Titles like Watch Dogs Legion will also benefit from the V-Cache, but at a high level. Number one, if you're playing with more of a mid-range GPU, you're likely going to be GPU limited. So getting the 9800X 3D over the 9700X in that scenario makes a lot less sense to me. To get the most out of this, you're going to want to pair with at least a mid-high to top-end GPU, so figure 4070 Super, 7900X T level of card is where I would start. Number two, if you're playing titles that tend to be less processor limited, like Red Dead 2, Assassin's Creed Mirage, Forza Horizon 5, you're also not going to see a whole lot of benefit from the V-Cache. That's where I would tend to steer towards the 9700X, which is absolutely still one of my favorites from Zen 5. If you want gaming's best of the best, this is it now. And if that's your MO, the cost of the CPU, it's going to be dwarfed by your GPU's cost and total system cost anyway, right? So that's not going to be a consideration at that point. But yeah, for a jack of all trades that happens to be a master of gaming, the price is what it is. And if history is any indication, as the price drops a bit, this will be even more of a no-brainer than the 7800X3, since you no longer have to give up productivity performance versus the non-X3D counterpart. And if you are after a master of all things, best of both worlds type of chip, definitely hang on for the anticipated 9950X3D. For the 9800X3D, you're definitely going to want to factor in the cost and space for a good cooler. So I'll drill down in more detail in that separate video shortly, but if you do want to take advantage of the productivity performance, 240 AIO or bigger tower air coolers where I would start. I think you will be able to get by with a decent single tower, but you're going to lose some performance for the non-gaming stuff. But unlike the 7800X 3D, which was more dialed down power-wise and was actually still pretty decent with small top-down coolers in SFF, so long as your base plate was good, small cases and small coolers like I cover a lot here on this channel. 140 watts actually starts getting into that more moderately high cooling needs category, so do take note there. That being said, if you are strictly only gaming with this, which many of you will be, or you don't care if you lose a little bit of non-gaming performance, as an example, you'll probably lose about 10 to 13% at 90 watts, which is going to be similar to 7800X 3D power levels, then you will absolutely be fine getting by with less cooler. Plus, the cold plate quality isn't as critical with the redesign, plus it has a higher max operating temp. So in that scenario, though, I would still strongly consider the 9700X, which is cheaper, and at its 65 watt TDP, it's very, very good also. Just consider if you need the V-Cache. Board-wise, while it will run great on the new X870 and X870E motherboards, I'd be perfectly happy running this on a good B650 or B650E board, just like with the 7800X 3D. And an example of this in the ITX space is going to be the MSI B650i or ASUS B650EI. So there you have it. It's a great CPU. It's a bit different from Zen 5 launches that we've seen so far because, well, for gaming, yeah, the gains are still more reserved in that incremental 5-ish, single-digit % gains arena. This actually completely blows the outgoing 7800X 3D out of the water for non-gaming stuff. So it actually gets a lot of the added multi-core performance via more power, but being able to draw down more power happens to be a result of AMD's V-Cache repositioning. So this one significant change has led to a much more well-rounded have your cake and eat it 2 Ryzen 7. It's a really fun one, and well done by AMD. It's highly recommended for that use case. So I sincerely hope you enjoyed this review and found it helpful. So please leave a like. As mentioned, I will have a cooling video dropping tomorrow. And please make sure you're subscribed and check out the links for the CPU down below if you are shopping. Big thanks for watching today.